For 15 years, I trusted my wife. She and my mother-in-law treated my daughter like a stranger small room. Cold meals. No love. I thought we were a happy family. Until one night she whispered, "Dad, something's wrong." I looked into it. What I found changed everything. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Henry Cole's hands are never fully clean. That was the thing about running an auto shop. The grease worked itself into the creases of his knuckles no matter how long he scrubbed. He had stopped fighting it years ago. It was just part of him now, the same way early mornings were, and late nights, and the particular weight of exhaustion that followed 12 hours of labor and a 40-minute drive home to a house that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. He lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, the kind of place where the houses were spread far enough apart that you could go days without seeing your neighbors, but close enough that a block party still made sense. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy, just solid houses with decent lawns and enough space to raise a family without everyone bumping into each other around every corner. He had bought the house when the neighborhood was still building, paid cash for the lot and most of the construction because he didn't like owing banks more than he had to. That had been 12 years ago. Back then he thought he was setting down roots. Back then he believed the ground was solid. Cole's Auto and Repair sat on a corner lot off Highway 75, wedged between a tire distributor and an empty lot that had been waiting for a purpose since before Henry ever arrived. He had opened the shop 11 years ago with one hydraulic lift, a set of used tools bought at an estate sale in Muskogee, and a reputation that did not exist yet because he had to build it from scratch. The first 3 years, he worked alone. He ate lunch standing at his workbench because there was no good reason to stop moving. He returned customer calls at 10 o'clock at night. He missed weddings and weekend barbecues and a graduation party for his cousin in Arkansas, and every time he missed something he told himself he was doing it for his family. He was working, so they didn't have to worry. He was building something that would last. That was the story he told himself. For a long time, he believed it. The shop had grown into something real. By the time Holly turned 11, Henry employed 4 mechanics and a front desk coordinator named Linda, who handled scheduling and customer calls. He had a waiting list for oil changes on weekday mornings and a reputation, built slowly and deliberately, as the shop that didn't add to your bill without calling first. He had taken a small business loan twice and paid it back ahead of schedule both times. He had built something that worked, and it had cost him the kind of time that once spent doesn't come back. Charlotte handled the home. She was organized in a way Henry had always found impressive, almost intimidating, the kind of organized that went beyond keeping the bills in order. She kept a color-coded calendar on the wall and a backup on her phone. She planned grocery runs by aisle and never doubled back. She maintained a household inventory in a spreadsheet Henry had never once looked at, but whose existence he found quietly reassuring. When she walked into a room full of people, they adjusted. Not because she was loud, but because she spoke with a precision that made everyone around her feel slightly underprepared. Henry had fallen for her quickly and hard. He'd been 31 when they married, certain of very few things and certain of her. He had thought he was lucky. Her mother, Marlene Voss, had moved into the spare bedroom 3 years ago following a hip surgery that turned out to need less recovery time than anyone expected. The original plan was 6 weeks, maybe 8 if she had a rough patch. Henry had agreed to it without much argument because it seemed like the decent thing to do, because Charlotte had pressed for it with a particular insistence that made objection feel like cruelty, and because he had been in the middle of a busy stretch at the shop and had signed on to the arrangement with a distracted half-attention he sometimes gave to things that seemed manageable at the time. Marlene never left. She unpacked a second wardrobe 7 months in. She rearranged the kitchen cabinets in a way that made Henry unable to find anything for 2 weeks, and when he mentioned it, she told him the new arrangement was more efficient. She had opinions about the thermostat, the dish soap brand, the way Henry loaded the dishwasher, and the programming choices on the television. She called Henry practical, using the word the way certain people use it, as something that sounds like a compliment, but is actually the politest available way of saying you do not find someone interesting. Henry let it all happen. He told himself it was easier. He told himself that peace had a cost, and the cost here was manageable. He would come home from a long day and sit down to dinner and nod along to conversations he had no stake in. And when he went to bed, he would tell himself that he was keeping the household stable, that the arrangement wasn't ideal, but it was temporary, that things would level out. He should have understood, much earlier, what that particular kind of peace was costing his daughter. Holly was 11 years old, and she was quiet in a way that kept Henry awake at night when he allowed himself to think about it directly. She had been his from the beginning, though not biologically. Her birth mother, a woman named Diane, had been Henry's closest friend from the year they both worked at the same parts warehouse in their mid-20s. Diane had been sharp and funny and deeply loyal, the kind of person who remembered the things you told her in passing and asked about them months later. When Holly was 2, Diane died in a car accident on a rainy stretch of highway outside Broken Arrow. It happened fast. There was no long illness, no warning, no time to make arrangements. There was just Diane and then the absence of her, and a 2-year-old girl with nowhere certain to go. Henry had stepped in without needing to think about it too long. He adopted Holly legally before she started kindergarten. She was his daughter. That was a fact as solid to him as anything he owned. Holly smiled when he came home. She helped clear the table after dinner without being asked. She did her homework at the kitchen table with her pencils arranged in a line and her notebook open flat and her water glass pushed to the far corner so it wouldn't spill. She was by most surface measures a well-behaved child, and that surface was exactly what made the small things Henry started noticing so unsettling. She was bright. That was the thing about Holly that had been clear from the time she was small. She paid attention to everything. She remembered things adults said to each other in passing, things they assumed she hadn't heard or hadn't retained. She made connections between ideas that surprised her teachers. Her third-grade teacher had called Henry in for a conference to talk about Holly's reading level and had used the word exceptional, and Henry had driven home from that meeting feeling something he hadn't expected, a particular brand of pride that sat deeper than ordinary parental satisfaction. He had been given a child the world had not been kind to early, and she was turning into a person of remarkable substance. He thought about that conference sometimes in the months that followed and felt the particular shame of understanding how much he had taken his eyes off her. She always ate after everyone else, not because she was slow or came to the table late, but because that seemed to be the unspoken rule. Charlotte would sit. Marlene would sit. Food would be served or set out, and Holly would wait, and nobody would comment on it, because it had become normal. Henry had only recently begun arriving home early enough to see the full shape of dinner, and what he saw nagged at him. Her clothes were older than they should be, not visibly worn out. Holly kept her things neat, folded each morning, hung each evening, but the shirts she wore were the same ones from 2 school years back. The previous fall, Henry had handed Charlotte $100 before the school shopping weekend, and told her to get Holly whatever she needed. Charlotte had thanked him. He had gone to work and never followed up. He was beginning to understand that was a pattern and not a minor one. Holly avoided sitting near Charlotte, not dramatically or in a way that read as obvious behavior to someone not paying close attention. But there was a careful geography to how she positioned herself at the dinner table, on the couch, at the kitchen counter. She always chose the seat that was one removed. She always left space. Once Henry started seeing it, he could not stop seeing it. It was in every room they shared. She never asked for anything. Not for a new book or a treat or an extra 20 minutes of screen time. Not to have a friend over for dinner or to stay up late on a Friday. She accepted whatever was offered and disappeared quietly upstairs when the evening wound down, taking nothing and asking for nothing, like a child who had learned that wanting things created problems. Henry brought it up to Charlotte one Sunday afternoon while she was in the kitchen scrolling her phone, leaning against the counter with the posture of someone who had already decided the conversation wasn't worth full attention. "I think she's pulling away," Henry said. "Holly, something feels off with her." Charlotte glanced up briefly. "She's at that age. Stop worrying. She barely talks at dinner. She doesn't ask for anything. She eats after. Kids don't talk at dinner. That's completely normal." Charlotte set her phone face down, which meant she was annoyed, not that she was giving him her full attention. She doesn't seem comfortable in her own house. Henry. Charlotte's voice had that practiced patience in it, the particular register she used when she was managing him. You're projecting. You come home late, and you feel guilty, and you look for problems that match how you feel. She's fine. From the hallway, Marlene's voice arrived before she did. That girl has always been sensitive, she said, appearing in the doorway with a dish towel she was already done using. Takes after her mother. She said it meaning Diane, and she said it the way people say things they believe are sympathetic, but are actually just a way of closing a subject. Henry looked at the two of them. He thought about saying more. Then he thought about how the rest of that conversation would go. The patient explanations, the counterexamples, the way he would end up feeling like the person who had misread a situation that everyone else understood clearly. And he said nothing. He drove back to the shop that Sunday and stayed until 9. He told himself he was being dramatic. He told himself Charlotte and Marlene were there during the hours he wasn't, and they would know if something was seriously wrong. He told himself a lot of things that evening, and the thing all of them had in common was that they made it easier to keep doing what he was already doing. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of night that gave no warning. No argument earlier in the evening, no unusual tension at dinner, nothing that told Henry to stay awake and pay attention. He had gotten home at 8, found a plate of leftovers on the counter that Charlotte had not warmed up, eaten standing at the kitchen island because he was too tired to sit properly, and gone upstairs before 10. Outside, the wind had picked up. The house settled in the cold the way old houses did, clicking and creaking in the walls. He was somewhere between waking and sleep when he heard it. A soft voice, careful and low, like someone who needed something badly enough to ask, but was trying not to disturb the whole house doing it. Dad! Henry sat up in the dark. His eyes adjusted slowly to the faint gray light from the hallway. Holly stood in the doorway of his bedroom, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her feet bare on the hardwood. She was holding the edge of the blanket with both hands. In the faint light, he could see that her fingers were pale. Hey, he said, keeping his voice low. What's going on? She stepped inside, not all the way, just enough. Can I sleep in your room tonight? Did something happen? She hesitated. He watched her look at the floor, then back up at him. And what he saw in her face was not the expression of a child who had a bad dream or heard a strange sound in the night. It was older than that. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had gotten too tired to carry it alone anymore. I don't think Mom likes me anymore, she said. The room was quiet. The heater clicked on somewhere behind the wall. Henry did not say anything for a long moment. He was thinking about the way she had said it. Not crying, not with the escalated emotion of a child making an accusation, but with the flat, careful certainty of someone reporting a conclusion they had already tested and confirmed. Like she had weighed the evidence over many months, quietly, alone in her room, and had arrived at an answer she wished she could disprove and couldn't. Come here, he said. She crossed the room and climbed onto the bed beside him, lying down with the blanket tucked around herself like a barrier. He lay back and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in the yard with a sound like breathing. He did not tell her she was wrong, because he no longer believed that she was. He lay there long after Holly's breathing slowed into sleep. The house was still. Charlotte was on the other side of the wall. Marlene was down the hall in the room Henry had once thought of as a temporary arrangement. Outside, the street was empty, and the October air had dropped the temperature low enough that he could feel the cold coming through the window frame. Henry had built this life with his own hands. 12-hour days and skipped vacations and 100 small sacrifices he had made without complaint, because the story he told himself was that it was all for his family. He had been the provider. He had been the one holding everything up from the outside. He had trusted that while he was gone, the home was safe. He had trusted the people inside it. He lay in the dark and thought about a little girl who had already accepted that her mother didn't like her, who had not said it crying, who had said it the way you say a thing when you have already grieved it and moved through to the other side. He had missed it. He had been right there in this house, sleeping in this bed, and he had missed all of it because it was easier to believe what he was told. He thought about the specific texture of that ease, the way he had arrived home tired and taken the explanations offered to him and filed them away and gone to sleep. The way Charlotte's certainty had functioned as a substitute for his own attention. He had worked hard to provide and had told himself that was the job. And while he was doing the job, someone had been slowly teaching his daughter that she was a burden. He lay there in the dark and understood that you do not get to blame your absence on your effort. The shop was not an excuse. It had never been an excuse. That ended tonight. Henry did not go to work the next morning. He called his lead technician, Ray, at 7:15 and told him there was a family situation and to open up without him. Ray had been with the shop for 6 years. He was the kind of man who handled things without needing much explanation, which was why Henry trusted him. Ray said fine and didn't ask questions, and Henry appreciated that more than he could express on a short phone call. He told Charlotte he was going in late, citing paperwork he needed to catch up on from home. Charlotte nodded without looking up from her coffee and said something about calling a plumber for the bathroom sink. Henry said he would look into it. Then he finished his coffee, said nothing further, waited until Charlotte moved to the living room, and walked out through the front door. He drove down the street, turned the corner, and parked along the curb behind a neighbor's oak tree. From there, with the angle of the late morning sun, he had a partial view of the kitchen window. He could see the table where Holly ate. He sat and he waited. He felt strange doing this. He was not a surveillance kind of man. He had spent most of his adult life trying to extend the benefit of the doubt because he believed that was the foundation of a functional household. You could not run a home on suspicion. But Holly's voice from a night before was still sitting inside his chest, that flat, resigned certainty of it, and he had crossed some internal threshold during those quiet hours. He was no longer willing to take anyone's word for what was happening in his own house. By 9 o'clock, he had what he needed. Holly was home. It was a teacher work day, no school, and she sat alone at the kitchen table while the television in the living room murmured with whatever Charlotte was watching. Marlene moved into the kitchen a few minutes after 9. Henry watched her set a plate in front of Holly. Half a sandwich, no drink, no fruit, nothing alongside it that suggested it was a complete meal rather than the minimum required to satisfy a complaint. Holly said something. Henry could not hear through the glass in the distance, but he could see the way she leaned slightly forward when she spoke, something uncertain in her posture, something asking. Marlene turned back toward her. Henry watched the set of the older woman's shoulders tight, impatient, and then her mouth moved, and whatever she said made Holly pull back and look down at the plate without further comment. Henry watched his daughter pick up the half sandwich. He watched Marlene leave the kitchen like the matter had been handled. Charlotte walked through the kitchen 60 seconds later. She went to the refrigerator, took something out, and walked back out without looking at Holly. Not with frustration, not with distraction, just with the indifference you show a piece of furniture. Holly sat at the table with half a sandwich and no drink and ate in complete silence. Henry stayed in the truck for another 40 minutes. He was committing this to memory. He was building a picture with enough detail that it could not be dismissed later as a misunderstanding or an exaggeration. Then he drove to the shop, asked Ray to cover the day, and drove home by a different route. He went in through the back door. Charlotte was on the phone in the living room and didn't hear him come in. He went upstairs. He knocked on Holly's door. She opened it looking surprised, then pleased, and then, in a way that cost him something to see, carefully neutral, as if she was checking whether the surprise was good or something else before she let herself react fully. "You're home," she said. "Decided to take the morning," he said. "Can I come in?" She stepped back, and he walked into her room and looked at it with the eyes of someone trying to see it clearly for the first time. The vent on the wall was closed. He had not known that before. The room was noticeably cooler than the hallway, not dramatically cold, but the difference was real and it was sustained. This was an event that had been closed that morning. He pressed the back of his hand to the exterior wall. The chill in the plaster was the kind that came from weeks of insufficient heat. Her mattress, when he sat on the edge of it, had almost no give. It was the original mattress from when they moved in, a practical choice made during a stretched financial period that he had meant to replace and had simply never come back to. Every time he thought about it, something more pressing had come up. He understood now that he had made himself too easy to distract. He looked at the closet. Neat and organized, Holly's doing, She had her mother's precision, even if she had never known her mother long enough to learn it from her. But what was in the closet was thin. 2 pairs of jeans, a handful of shirts, a sweater he remembered from her third-grade class photo. For an 11-year-old girl in late October in Oklahoma, it was not enough. He looked at her school backpack against the desk. "Can I look through your school stuff?" he said. "I just want to see how things are going with assignments." She shrugged the way kids shrug when they don't want to cause a fuss. He took that as permission and opened the backpack. Textbooks, pencils, a ruler, the standard debris. And in the side pocket, folded into careful quarters, several pieces of paper. They were assignments. Incomplete ones. Missing dates. Answer sections left half blank. The work of a child who was too occupied with something else to focus on school. He unfolded one slowly. A reading comprehension worksheet, 3 weeks old by the date at the top, the response section empty. He turned it over. On the back, in Holly's small, precise handwriting, "If I am quiet, they don't get mad." He unfolded the next one. Math worksheet, similarly untouched. He turned it over. "Grandma says I cost too much." Henry sat on the edge of that thin mattress and held those 2 pieces of paper and did not move. The guilt came first. That was what surprised him. Not anger, guilt. The particular sickness of understanding that he had been present and absent at the same time, that he had come home to this house every evening for months and eaten dinner and slept in the next room and told himself the noise he wasn't hearing was just the quiet of a peaceful household. He had trusted. He had looked away. He had made it easier on himself by believing what he was told. And while he did all that, his daughter had been writing survival notes on the backs of her homework and hiding them in a folded pocket where no one would find them. Then the anger came. It was quiet and cold. It did not feel like emotion. It felt like a decision being made in real time, steady and clear and completely without doubt. He folded the papers and placed them back exactly as he had found them. He zipped the backpack. He stood up. "I'm going to make you a real lunch," he said. "Come down when you're ready." Holly looked at him. Something moved through her face, not quite relief. She was too practiced at cautiousness for simple relief, but a loosening, like the careful set of her shoulders dropping by a single degree. "Okay," she said. Henry spent 3 days watching. Not from the street this time, but from inside his own house. He adjusted his hours, told Ray to manage the morning rush, and came home by noon each day. He paid attention in ways he had not paid attention in years. He watched how Holly moved through the rooms. He noticed where she sat and didn't sit. He paid attention to what Marlene's face did when Holly walked in, the flat assessment of it, the way her expression did not warm. He paid attention to Charlotte's silences around the girl, not hostile silences, which would have been something, but simply empty ones. Indifference that had settled into habit. On the second day, he called his lawyer. Dave Pratt worked family law out of a building on 4th Street downtown. Henry had used him once before for Holly's adoption, and he had found Dave to be the kind of man who listened before he spoke and spoke carefully when he did. Henry did not explain the full situation on the phone. He said he needed to come in and talk through some things that involve his household and his daughter. Dave's assistant scheduled him for Monday morning. On the evening of the 3rd day, with Marlene upstairs and Holly in the bath, Henry sat down across from Charlotte at the kitchen table and asked her a direct question. He had thought about how to do this. He knew Charlotte well enough to know the pitfalls. If he raised his voice, she would become the reasonable one, and he would become the volatile one. And she was skilled enough at managing a conversation that this could happen before he'd made a single substantive point. So he kept his voice flat and his posture open and his hands on the table in front of him. "Why is Holly treated differently in this house?" he said. Charlotte set down her glass. She looked at him with that particular expression, the one that lived between patience and irritation, the look she used when she was preparing to manage something that inconvenienced her. "What does that mean differently?" "You know what it means. The way she eats, the clothes she doesn't have, the way she's spoken to, the way she's not spoken to at all." Charlotte exhaled through her nose. "Henry, you've been home for 3 days, and you've made yourself an expert on how I run things." "I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm asking you a question. And I'm telling you that you don't understand the full picture. You leave at 6 in the morning and come home at 8 at night, and you think you see everything. You don't. Then explain it to me." She looked at him. He could see her deciding something, running a calculation behind her eyes. Then Marlene was in the doorway. Henry didn't know if she'd come down because she'd heard voices or because she'd been waiting for an opportunity. It made no difference. You want to understand how this works? Marlene came into the kitchen and sat down without being invited. She had always moved through his house like she had equal standing in it. That girl is a financial burden. Charlotte carries more than you see. Henry looked at her steadily. She's my daughter. Not biologically, Marlene said. The precision of it was deliberate. That doesn't mean anything, Henry said. It means something when there's money involved, Marlene said. She was looking at him in a way that suggested she had been working toward this conversation for some time. That trust isn't sitting idle. There's value there, real value, and it doesn't make sense for it to just wait around for a child who— Get out of my kitchen, Henry said. His voice was not raised. It was flat and final. Marlene stopped speaking mid-sentence. Henry looked at Charlotte. How much is it worth? Charlotte said nothing. I know about the developer, Henry said. I saw the email. I saw you close a laptop. I didn't understand what I was seeing then. I do now. How much? Charlotte looked at the table for a moment. When she looked up, she had made her decision about how to play this. The strategy she chose was honesty, or a version of it, the kind that admits what it cannot hide and hopes the admission itself will look like transparency. The land was appraised last spring, she said. It came in at approximately $300,000. There is a developer with active interest in the area. Henry sat with that number. He had known about the trust in the abstract since the day he filed Holly's adoption paperwork. At the time, the land had been worth almost nothing. A rural parcel out in Creek County, undeveloped, attached to Diane's family name through her father's estate. The trust had been established as a formality, a way to hold the asset until Holly was old enough to manage it herself. Henry had signed the paperwork and gone back to work and never thought about it again because there was nothing to think about. It wasn't money anyone had. It was a future amount that belonged to a 2-year-old girl and would be waiting for her at 18. Now he thought about the development boom that had been creeping through the Creek County area for the past 2 years. He had read about it in the local paper without connecting it to anything personal. New roads being built, infrastructure expanding, land that had sat idle for decades, suddenly worth something to people who built things. I control the trust until she's 18, he said. Any changes to the trust terms need my approval and my signature. Charlotte didn't respond. You need me to sign off, Henry said. That's what this is. The whole thing. The way she's treated. The way you've made this house a place she doesn't feel safe in. It's been designed to make me want to move on. To make me want to simplify things. To make me want to take whatever you offered and walk away and bring Holly with me and sign whatever paperwork made it easy. He paused. That's what you were building toward. Charlotte said nothing. Her face was composed and still, and the composure of it told him more than an argument would have. Yes, Henry said, not to her, to himself, confirming the shape of what had been sitting under everything, building in the dark while he was 12 miles away working. He stood up. He looked at Charlotte one more time. We'll talk more, but right now I need to think. He walked upstairs. He knocked on Holly's door. She was in her pajamas, her hair still damp from the bath, lying on her bed with a library book propped on her knees. He sat in the chair at her desk and asked her about the book. She told him about it. Something about a girl who could communicate with animals, which she found scientifically implausible but liked anyway. He listened. He asked a question. She answered and asked him one back. When she started to yawn, he told her to get some sleep and turn out her light. He stood in the hallway outside her door for a long time. $300,000. And a little girl who wrote survival notes on the backs of her homework because she had learned that silence was safer than asking. Henry did not sleep much in the days that followed, but he did not feel tired in the way he usually felt tired. He was running on something more purposeful than rest, a clarity that came from finally understanding the shape of the problem and knowing exactly what needed to be done about it. He met with Dave Pratt on Monday morning. Dave's office was straightforward. 2 chairs, a desk, a credenza stacked with folders, a window that looked out onto 4th Street and the morning foot traffic. Henry laid out everything from the beginning. The observations, the notes on the homework, the morning he'd parked down the block, the conversation with Charlotte about the trust. He went through it methodically, the way he thought through a difficult repair job, starting with what he knew for certain and working forward from there. Dave listened without interrupting. When Henry finished, Dave asked 3 clarifying questions and wrote notes in a yellow legal pad. Then he said, "Courts don't respond to impressions. They respond to patterns, and patterns need documentation. More than you probably think right now. The other side will work to characterize this as a domestic disagreement with conflicting accounts. Your job is to make sure the record speaks for itself." Henry asked what kind of documentation. Dave told him, "Photographs of the living conditions, Holly's room, the clothes vent, the mattress, the clothes. Dated written notes on what he observed, written down as close to the time of observation as possible, not reconstructed weeks later. Any recordings made in legally permissible ways. School records, Holly's attendance, her grades, her assignment completion over time, and a professional assessment, if possible, from someone who could speak to Holly's emotional state with clinical credibility." Henry drove home and started that afternoon. He photographed Holly's room while Charlotte was at the yoga class she attended on Thursday afternoons. The mattress, the vent, the closet contents. He photographed the kitchen, not to suggest it was bare, because it wasn't, but to establish what was available versus what Holly was being given. He wrote down the morning he had parked down the street. He wrote it in a small notebook he kept in a locked metal toolbox in his truck, the same kind of box he used for the shop. Registration papers, spare keys, tools he didn't want walking off. Nobody was going to find it by accident. He called Holly's school the following day and asked to speak with her homeroom teacher. Ms. Bartlett answered on the second ring. Henry introduced himself, said he was calling because he was concerned about Holly's engagement lately and wanted to understand what she was seeing. There was a pause before Ms. Bartlett answered, the kind of pause that comes when someone has been waiting for a specific phone call to arrive. She said Holly was bright and clearly capable. She said the assignment completion rate had dropped noticeably over the past few months. She said Holly was withdrawn compared to earlier in the year, that she participated less in class discussion, that there had been a couple of instances where she seemed preoccupied in a way that looked like more than ordinary distraction. Henry asked if she would be willing to share notes if it came to that. Ms. Bartlett said yes without hesitation. He also moved money. Not all of it, and not suddenly. He shifted funds gradually from the joint household account into a separate personal account that Charlotte didn't know existed, over the course of several weeks, in amounts that wouldn't draw attention. Enough to ensure that when the moment came, he had a foundation to work from that didn't depend on Charlotte's cooperation. He also contacted the trust administrator, a cautious, organized man named Mr. Ellison at a small downtown firm, and asked him directly about any pending requests or outstanding inquiries related to the trust. There had been one, a recent request, initiated through a third-party financial advisor, for review of the trust terms. Henry told Ellison to hold all action on the trust immediately, and that any changes to the trust structure would require his explicit approval in person. Ellison, who had been managing trust accounts long enough to recognize the architecture of what he was hearing, agreed without pushing back. Henry also contacted a child psychologist through Holly School District. Her name was Dr. Angela Ferris, and the school counselor had mentioned her name when Henry had called to ask about resources. Dr. Ferris agreed to schedule an initial session with Holly. Henry told Holly that Dr. Ferris was someone who talked to kids about school and feelings, and that there was nothing wrong with going to see her. A lot of kids did. Holly said okay in the way she said most things, carefully watching for what the right response was supposed to be. After the first session, Dr. Ferris called Henry. She said she would need a second session before she could form any clinical impressions, but she said in a tone that told him she had already begun forming them. And every day, without making it an event, Henry stopped leaving Holly alone with Charlotte and Marlene. He adjusted his schedule. He came home at 6 instead of 8, sometimes earlier. He sat at the kitchen table in the morning while the household moved around him, and he made Holly's breakfast himself, eggs and toast and a glass of juice, and set it in front of her while he drank his coffee. He drove her to school himself. He picked her up. He was present in the house in a way he had not been present in years, and he watched Charlotte notice it and recalibrate. A tightening around her eyes, a new pattern to her movements in the house, more deliberate, more aware of where he was. She knew something had shifted. He didn't explain it to her. He just stayed. Henry spent 3 weeks building what Dave Pratt called his record and what Henry thought of, more simply, as the truth written down. It did not feel like strategy while he was doing it. It felt like the work of a man who had woken up inside his own house and was finally seeing it clearly. Each morning he woke before the rest of the household, made a cup of coffee while the kitchen was still quiet, and sat at the table writing notes in the small notebook. He wrote with a specificity that felt almost clinical: dates, times, what Holly ate, what she was wearing, what was said, and who said it. He did not editorialize. He did not use words like cruel or neglected because he didn't need to. The facts, written plainly and in order, made their own argument. He gave a notebook entries to Dave at the end of each week. Dave reviewed them and told him he was doing it right. There was other work happening too, quieter work, the kind that didn't show up in documentation but mattered just as much. Henry was rebuilding something with Holly that he hadn't fully understood was broken. He drove her to school every morning, 15 minutes each way, and he let her talk about whatever was on her mind without redirecting it toward anything useful. She talked about a class project on Oklahoma tribal history that she had been given permission to substitute for a regular geography assignment. She talked about a girl named Vivian who had started sitting with her at lunch and who was funny in a way that made Holly describe her with a precision that suggested she had thought about it carefully. She talked about a book she'd finished and immediately wanted to read again. Henry listened to all of it. He asked questions. He did not offer solutions to things that didn't need solving. And slowly, across those 15-minute drives, he watched something change in her. The careful blankness she wore at home, the practiced neutrality of a child who had learned that being readable was a liability, gave way in the car to something more open. She forgot, sometimes, to be guarded. She would finish a sentence and then laugh at herself for the enthusiasm in it, and then she would look at him and see that he wasn't bothered, and she would keep going. One morning in early November, she turned to him before she got out of the truck. "Are you staying home different now?" she asked. The question was genuine. She had noticed the shift and was trying to understand its cause without making assumptions. "Yeah," Henry said. "I'm making some changes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, picked up her backpack from the seat between them, and got out of the truck. He watched her walk toward the school entrance, her shoulders a degree more upright than they had been a month ago. He sat in the parking lot for a while after the doors closed behind her. Then he called Dave. "I think I have enough," he said. Dave agreed. "The school documentation, your own written record, the trust inquiry, and Dr. Ferris's assessment. It builds a coherent picture. It's not going to be a fast process. But you have grounds and you have evidence. What exactly are you asking for?" "Full custody," Henry said. "No shared arrangement. No co-trustee situation. Holly comes with me, and the trust stays exactly where it is." "That's the hardest to ask," Dave said. "Courts lean toward maintaining both parental relationships where possible. We'll need the Ferris assessment to carry real weight." "She submitted it yesterday," Henry said. "I think it will." There was a pause. "File within the week." Dave asked. "File tomorrow," Henry said. On a Thursday morning 2 weeks after the filing, Henry dropped Holly at school, drove back to the house, and came in through the front door to find Charlotte and Marlene sitting at the kitchen table with their morning coffee. He set his keys on the counter and sat down. He placed a manila envelope on the table in front of Charlotte. She looked at it, then at him. She didn't touch it yet. "Open it," he said. She pulled the envelope toward herself with the deliberate movements of someone making sure the act itself looked composed. She broke the seal and pulled out the documents. She read the first page carefully, and Henry watched her face as she read it, the particular stillness that came across her features when she was processing something significant and deciding simultaneously how to respond to it. Marlene leaned from her seat. "What is it?" "Divorce papers," Charlotte said. "Flat. Contained." Marlene's chair scraped back hard as she stood. "You are making a serious mistake," she said, directing it at Henry with the conviction of someone who believes their certainty is a form of authority. Henry did not look at her. He looked at Charlotte. "The second document is a custody filing. I'm asking for sole legal and physical custody of Holly." Charlotte's jaw tightened. She looked up from the papers and something moved in her eyes that he had not seen before. Not guilt, not remorse, but a flicker of something that might have been the beginning of fear. She was still working to contain it. "You're doing this over nothing." "I'm doing this over everything," Henry said. "You're overreacting. Whatever you think you saw, look at the exhibit pages," Henry said. "Start from the back." She flipped through. He watched her move through it. The photographs, the dated notes, the school communications, the letter from Ms. Bartlett, the assessment from Dr. Ferris, the documentation from the trust administrator showing the date and nature of the recent inquiry. She moved through it with the careful attention of someone building a full picture. She stopped on one page longer than the others. Henry knew what was on that page. He had typed it himself, centered it on the sheet, dated it to the afternoon he had found the papers in Holly's backpack. 2 lines, 2 quotes, word for word, in his daughter's handwriting. Charlotte said, "She's exaggerating." But her voice had lost its precision, the edges of it going soft in a way Henry had never heard from her. "She doesn't exaggerate," Henry said. "She underreports. That's the whole problem." Marlene came around the table, and Henry stood. He did not move toward her. He simply stood, which was enough to stop her movement entirely. There was something in his posture, not threat, not aggression, just absolute stillness and absolute certainty, that she read correctly. "You can't walk away with everything," Marlene said. Her voice had gone thin and strained, the voice of someone watching a plan collapse. "We'll fight this." "You can," Henry said. He picked up his truck keys from the counter. "But read the full exhibit list first, particularly the section on the trust inquiry timeline. Read it carefully." He walked out of the kitchen. He had a full day of work at the shop, and he went to it. He did not feel the particular satisfaction of a dramatic exit. He just felt clear. He felt like a man who had done what needed to be done and could now let the process take over. The legal process took 4 months from the initial filing to the final hearing, and it was not dramatic in the way Henry had half expected. There were no shouting matches in courthouse hallways, no scenes before a judge where someone's composure failed under pressure. It was measured and procedural and grinding in a way that required a different kind of endurance. Not the endurance of confrontation, but the endurance of waiting, of paperwork, of sitting in a room full of professionals using careful language to describe something that was, at its core, a little girl who wrote notes on the backs of her homework. Charlotte retained an attorney named Foley, who came into the first conference call with the polished confidence of someone who won often enough to have opinions about how these things usually went. He made early overtures about settlement, shared custody arrangements, joint management of the trust, language about Holly's best interests that sounded reasonable and was designed to give Charlotte what she actually wanted. Henry told Dave to decline. "She'll push for compromise," Dave said. "Judges often prefer negotiated outcomes. A reasonable settlement offer can influence how a judge views both parties." "Understand," Henry said. "We go to the hearing." He had reasons. During his 3 weeks of documentation, he had pulled Holly school records going back 2 years, and what they showed was a consistent decline in assignment completion and classroom engagement that mapped almost precisely to when Marlene had moved into the house and taken on a larger presence in the daily household. He had also worked with Dr. Ferris on a formal clinical assessment, and Dr. Ferris had 2 decades of courtroom experience to go with her clinical expertise. She knew how to write an assessment that was defensible, and she knew how to present it. He had also, over the months since the confrontation, paid close attention to Charlotte's financial behavior. She had made several purchases through joint accounts in the weeks after he served the papers. Nothing dramatic, nothing that crossed into the territory of asset dissipation that would have required a separate legal motion, but enough to tell him she had understood the shape of what was happening and was trying to manage her position. He documented those too. He brought them to Dave not because they changed anything significant, but because he wanted a complete record, and because he had learned in the years of running a business that the time to be thorough was before you needed it, not after. The assessment described a child showing anxiety symptoms consistent with a home environment involving emotional neglect. It described a child who had developed a survival strategy of compliance and minimized expression. It described patterns in Holly's speech and affect during their sessions that, in Dr. Ferris's clinical judgment, were more associated with chronic accommodation to a stressful home environment than with ordinary childhood development. Charlotte's attorney argued that the assessment was based on limited observation. Dr. Ferris, who had the quiet authority of someone who had been challenged in courtrooms many times and had found the experience instructive rather than intimidating, explained that 2 clinical sessions was a standard initial assessment period and that her conclusions were consistent with and supported by the documentary record. The school records were entered. The photographs were entered. Henry's dated observation notes were entered. The trust documentation was entered, including the financial records that showed when Charlotte's financial advisor had initiated the trust review, not long after the development company's initial inquiry, and without informing Henry. Dave walked through the timeline with methodical patience. Foley argued that Charlotte had been acting out of a general interest in responsible estate planning. Dave noted the timing and said nothing further, which was more effective. The judge was a woman named Honorable Ruth Acker, in her mid-50s, with the particular attentiveness of someone who had presided over enough family cases to stop being surprised by any of them and to focus entirely on the record in front of her. She asked Charlotte's attorney one question directly. At any point had Charlotte notified Henry that the trust was under review? After a pause, the answer was no. Judge Acker wrote something in her notes. Charlotte testified. She was composed and articulate and reasonable sounding, because those were her genuine skills and she used them. She spoke about the challenges of managing a household largely alone, about Holly's emotional sensitivity, about the difficulty of raising a child with particular needs when the other parent was consistently absent from daily life. She spoke about Holly's tendency to dramatize situations. She said she loved Holly and that the relationship between them had been misconstrued. Henry testified after her. He kept his answers short. He did not editorialize or offer opinions that hadn't been asked for. He described what he had observed, when he had observed it, and what he had done in response. He let the evidence speak. When Foley cross-examined him on his own extended absences from the household, Henry agreed with each point calmly. Yes, he had worked long hours. Yes, he had been away more than he should have been. Yes, there were things he had missed. He said all of this without defensiveness because it was true, and because the question before the court was not whether he had been a perfect parent, but whether Holly was safe. Marlene was also called. Under cross-examination, Dave asked her specifically about the remark regarding Holly's cost, documented in Henry's notes and referenced in Holly's own words during the Ferris sessions. Marlene said the remark had been taken out of context. Dave asked what the proper context was. Marlene said she didn't recall the precise wording. Dave asked if she recalled the general meaning. Marlene said she had been discussing household finances in general terms. Judge Acker watched that exchange without expression. The ruling came 12 days later, on a gray Tuesday morning in late February. Sole legal and physical custody to Henry. Supervised visitation for Charlotte, contingent on a parenting assessment. Marlene granted no custodial role of any kind. The trust formally insulated, managed by a professional fiduciary until Holly's 18th birthday, with any modification requiring court approval and fiduciary notification. A provision explicitly noting that the trust was not to be accessed, modified, or subject to third-party review without court oversight. Charlotte filed a motion to reconsider 3 weeks later. Judge Acker denied it without a hearing. Henry picked Holly up from school in the afternoon the ruling came through. He didn't go through the details with her. She was 11 and the details were not hers to carry. He told her they were moving into a new chapter and that she was going to be okay and that she could ask him anything she wanted whenever she was ready. She thought about this for a moment. Then she asked if they could stop for ice cream. He said yes. She ordered 2 scoops of vanilla and ate both of them in the front seat of his truck while he drove home slowly, the window cracked, the February air sharp and clean. He thought, on that drive, about what it meant that her first request after hearing that her life was changing had been something as simple as ice cream. Not a question about where they were going to live. Not a question about Charlotte. Just 2 scoops of vanilla from a place she liked, eaten slowly in a warm truck on a cold afternoon. He thought it might be the most honest summary of what she needed, which was not the dramatic and the consequential, but the ordinary and the reliable. Things you could count on, things that were just there. 6 months after the final ruling, the picture was quiet and ordinary, which was the nature of real consequences. Charlotte had moved to a two-bedroom apartment on the east side of Tulsa. She had returned to the insurance company where she had worked years before, a full-time position with benefits sufficient for her needs, which were now calibrated to what she could actually afford on her own income. She attended supervised visitation sessions with Holly, who went to them without obvious reluctance, because Henry had made a deliberate choice not to put anything of his own anger into Holly's relationship with her mother. He had done what he needed to do, and it was done. Keeping Holly in a state of hostility towards Charlotte would have cost Holly more than it cost Charlotte, and Henry had no interest in that trade. His own feelings about Charlotte, what she had done, how carefully she had done it, what it said about the years of the marriage he had thought he understood, he kept where they belonged, contained, removed from anything that touched his daughter's daily life. He had examined them thoroughly in the months since the filing, had sat with them on quiet evenings at the kitchen table after Holly was asleep, and had arrived at something that was not forgiveness and was not hatred, but was simply an accurate assessment. Charlotte had been a particular kind of person. He had not seen it clearly. He saw it clearly now. That was enough. Marlene had relocated to Lawton to stay with a distant relative, a woman who had agreed to the arrangement out of family obligation rather than enthusiasm. She had no legal standing in Holly's life, no access to the trust, no role in any household that Henry controlled. She called Charlotte occasionally. She did not call Henry. The influence she had spent 3 years building had dissolved the moment the foundation it was built on, access to Henry's house and Henry's trust, was removed. The trust continued to grow. The development company had moved to an adjacent parcel, but interest in the region remained strong, and the land's value was trending upward. By the time Holly turned 18, the fiduciary's projections suggested it would be worth significantly more than the original appraisal. It was locked down and untouchable, and Henry checked in with the fiduciary once a quarter the way he checked the oil in his truck, not because he expected problems, but because maintenance was how you prevented them. At the shop, Henry had promoted Ray to manager and given himself most Fridays off. He used those Fridays to be home when Holly got back from school, and the rhythm of it, being simply present at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon when she walked through the door, turned out to matter more than any of the larger gestures. She would drop her backpack in the hall and find him at the kitchen table or in the garage or pulling weed from the front bed, and she would stop and say something, anything, whatever was at the top of her mind from the day, and he would stop what he was doing and listen. It was a small thing. It turned out to be the whole thing. Holly was doing better in school. Ms. Bartlett sent a brief email in October noting that Holly's participation had improved and her assignment completion was back near the top of the class. Holly had also completed her Oklahoma tribal history project, the one she'd been excited about, and it had been selected as an example piece for the district's curriculum showcase. She told Henry about the selection at dinner, matter-of-factly, as if it were routine, and then watched his face to see what he thought. He told her it wasn't a surprise, that the project was excellent, and he meant it. She looked at her plate and smiled in a way she couldn't quite hide. He fixed up Holly's room on a Saturday in early November, 3 weeks after the school year had properly settled. He had been planning it for a while, researching mattresses in the evenings after Holly went to sleep, making a list in the Notes app on his phone that he added to and revised over several weeks. He had always been careful with money, which meant he knew exactly what things cost and what was worth spending on, and he had made his decisions accordingly. A mattress with real support, the kind that would last. A bed frame with a headboard that he bought flat-packed from a furniture store and assembled himself, which took 4 hours, 2 YouTube tutorials, and one extended moment of conflict with a strip bolt that he eventually resolved with a combination of WD-40 and force of will. A lamp for her desk that gave off warm light rather than the cold overhead fixture that had been there before. A string of small lights she had pointed to at a home goods store the previous weekend, running them along the shelf above her desk the way she had shown him in a photo on her phone. A bookshelf for the corner, which he added to the list at the last minute, because she was a reader and readers needed somewhere to put books. He opened the vent while he was in there. He turned the handle all the way until it sat fully open. He stood looking at it for a moment before he moved on. Holly came upstairs at 3 in the afternoon to find him cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by the flat-pack hardware for the bookshelf, a half-eaten sandwich on the floor beside him. The instruction diagram unfolded to its full confusing size across his knees. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at the room. She looked at the new bed, the headboard, the lamp, the string of lights along the shelf. She walked in slowly, the way you walk into a place you want to look at properly, and she touched the edge of the mattress with the back of her hand, testing the firmness of it. She looked at the lamp. She ran one finger along the headboard. "You did all this," she said. "Ray helped me carry the mattress upstairs," Henry said. "I'm giving him full credit for that part." Holly sat on the bed. The mattress held firm, and even beneath her, she bounced once, almost experimentally, like she was verifying something she hadn't let herself assume. Something in her face went soft in a way that Henry looked away from, back to the hardware in front of him. He heard her lie back on the new mattress. He kept working. They stayed like that for a while. Holly on the bed, looking at the ceiling, Henry fitting shelf components together with a rubber mallet, the late afternoon light coming in through the window at a low angle. Outside, somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice at something and stopped. A car moved past slowly. The neighborhood's ordinary sounds settled around them. After a while, Holly said, "Are you mad at Mom?" Henry set down the rubber mallet. He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about Charlotte at that kitchen table, composing her face into patience while she explained things she had no intention of changing. He thought about the trust inquiry and the financial advisor and the careful architecture of what she had been building. He thought about Marlene saying that a child cost too much. He thought about a little girl lying awake in a cold room, writing the truth on the backs of worksheets she never turned in. "No," he said. "I'm done trusting her." Holly was quiet for a moment. "That makes sense," she said. He picked up the rubber mallet and went back to the bookshelf. A few minutes later, Holly came off the bed and sat on the floor beside him without being asked. She began sorting the hardware bags, bolts in one pile, cam locks in another, small plastic end caps in a third. She had her own precision about it, a quiet, methodical patience that Henry recognized and had always admired. She held pieces steady when he needed a second hand. She read the part numbers off the diagram when his reading glasses were across the room. When he installed a shelf bracket on the wrong side and had to take it apart and start again, she didn't say anything, just waited, holding the correct bracket out to him. When the shelf was finished, they both stood back and looked at it. It stood straight and solid in the corner, the grain of the wood catching the warm light from the lamp. "It's good," she said. "Not bad," he said. That evening, after a dinner of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables, Henry's entire culinary range, more or less, they ended up on the couch watching a nature documentary Holly had chosen. It was about deep-sea creatures and bioluminescence, a subject she had become intensely interested in after a school library book and had been researching with the particular focus of a kid who had found something genuinely astonishing and couldn't understand why everyone didn't know about it. Henry knew nothing about bioluminescence. He asked questions. Some of them were deliberately wrong because he liked watching her correct him, the way she sat up straighter, the way her voice got precise. She explained things to him with the kind of patient clarity that was its own form of trust, talking to someone you were sure wouldn't dismiss what you were saying. At some point, without making a decision about it, she shifted on the couch and leaned against him. Slowly, carefully, the way a person moves when they're testing whether a surface will hold before they give it their weight. Henry did not move. He kept his eyes on the television. He kept his breathing even. She stayed there for the rest of the documentary, and when the credits rolled, she said good night in a voice that was ordinary and unhurried, and she went upstairs to her new room without being asked. Her footsteps on the stairs were steady. No hesitation on the landing. No pause at the top. Henry sat in the quiet of the living room for a while after. The television was off. The house was still. The November cold pressed against the windows from outside, but the rooms were warm. He thought about the version of himself from 2 months ago, exhausted from the shop, eating cold leftovers at the kitchen island, telling himself everything was fine. He thought about how much could quietly go wrong in a house while the bills were paid and the surface looked normal. He thought about the night a little girl came to his bedroom door holding a blanket, her hands pale from the cold of a room he hadn't known was cold, and said something in a voice so flat and certain that he had not been able to dismiss it even when his whole instinct was to find a way to. He had made mistakes. He owned them. He had been absent when he should have been present, had believed what was easy to believe, had let things go on longer than they should have. He would carry those mistakes. That was fair, but he had chosen his daughter when it mattered. He had chosen her completely and without reservation, and he had not stopped choosing her, and he would not stop. That was the whole of it. He stood up, turned off the kitchen light, checked the back door the way he always did before bed, and went upstairs. At the top of the stairs, he paused for a moment outside Holly's door. A faint, warm light came from beneath it, the string of lights still on. He almost knocked. Then he decided she was fine. He knew she was fine. He went to his own room and lay down. And for the first time in a very long time, he was asleep before 10 o'clock. Outside, the November wind moved through the neighborhood the way it always had, through the oak trees and past the quiet houses, across the lawns that all looked the same after dark. Somewhere down the block a light was still on. A dog settled somewhere. The ordinary world continued its ordinary work, indifferent to the small victories and corrections that happened inside the houses it surrounded. Henry had not won anything the world would have noticed. He had not defeated anyone. He had simply seen what was happening, stopped pretending otherwise, and acted with the resources available to him. He had been a father when his daughter needed one. That was enough. That was everything.